Even though 10 years had passed since the death of her parents, Amanda remembered every detail of the terrible car accident that took the lives of her mother and father. On that fateful day, Mary and Robert Taylor took their 5-year-old daughter Amanda on an out-of-town picnic to celebrate the upcoming Independence Day. Unfortunately, the unfortunate fate intervened. And so, the bright plans of the family of a young businessman were never destined to come true. Of course, as Robert Taylor was getting ready to take his family to the picnic, he had no way of knowing that some half an hour later, a drunk driver would swirl into the oncoming traffic in his SUV. The collision was so strong that little Amanda got literally thrown out of the car on the impact. However, that was exactly what saved the little girl's life. In an instant, the 5-year-old Amanda was left an orphan, doomed to spend the rest of her childhood in an orphanage. Amanda's parents were wealthy people who were rather successful in the field of business and commerce. Unfortunately, after the funeral of the late couple, it turned out that all their financial assets were barely enough to cover their debt, and there wasn't a single cent left in their bank accounts. Apparently, the Taylor family was on the brink of bankruptcy before their demise. People rumored that it was because of a series of bad deals that the couple had made shortly before their death. Little Amanda was the only one who didn't believe that her parents' business had crumbled. Since none of the distant relatives of the family were willing to take custody of the girl, the social services placed her at an orphanage. The years spent within the walls of the institution were amongst the most difficult in Amanda's life. After being raised in a wealthy family, it was hard for the girl to get used to the conditions of the orphanage, especially since there were so many strict rules and procedures, which demanded unquestioning obedience from the students. However, despite it all, Amanda found the strength to endure all the hardships that invariably befell every orphan. But when she came of age, Amanda Taylor got thrown into the adult world, which was often unkind to people deprived of family support. Unfortunately, the young woman didn't have time to settle into her new life, because as soon as she left the orphanage, she had to immediately start looking for a job. Amanda went around at least a dozen firms and all kinds of organizations before she managed to get a job as a waitress in a cafe. Sure, it was hardly the perfect job, but the young woman had no other choice. Meanwhile, despite the lack of experience, joining the team turned out to be rather easy for Amanda. So she quickly delved into the intricacies of her new profession. What else do I need? The salary covers my basic needs, and there's also tips. It's not all that much, but it's still a nice bonus, the girl said to her friends. The cafe where Amanda worked was located in the very heart of the city, which is why it always had plenty of customers. Office workers, construction workers, and students, they all appreciated the moderate prices, convenient location, and quality of service that this establishment had long been proud of. One day, Amanda was hurrying to bring the order to one of the customers and stumbled on her way, accidentally spilling tea on the shirt of a young med student. Ouch, I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so awkward. Hold on a sec, I'll bring you some tissues, the woman exclaimed. Don't worry, miss. The shirt will dry quickly, and it won't even leave a stain, the stranger replied, smiling. As it turned out a little later, the young man's name was David Thompson, and he was in his senior year of med school. Of course, he forgave the young waitress for her awkwardness, and refusing to complain, even left her a generous tip. Look, our Amanda's got a boyfriend. I'm not kidding. He gave her $100 tip. Be careful, or he'll charm you and then dump you, Susan said enviously. She already had been working at the cafe for 3 years. Amanda lowered her eyes in embarrassment and, unable to come up with an appropriate retort, decided to stay quiet. She was well aware that Susan was jealous of her looks, which often became the object of attention and compliments from the customers. The rest of the shift flew by, bringing closer the pleasant moment that every employee of the cafe was always looking forward to. But when Amanda went outside, she saw something strange. There was a man standing at the entrance of the cafe, and he was holding a bouquet of beautiful white roses. Having taken a closer look, Amanda realized that it was the same guy that she had spilled tea on earlier that day. "Are those for me?" the young woman whispered incredulously. She never received such gifts before. "Of course they're for you. Why are you so surprised?" David answered with a smile. Amanda simply couldn't give an answer to this question. She lived most of her life in an orphanage, and thus she wasn't used to getting attention from people she didn't know. But this young man, David, seemed so sweet that Amanda cast aside all doubts and gladly accepted his courtship. The young people talked about everything in the world, joked around, and even noticed how they crossed the invisible line and shared their first kisses. It was like a fairy tale in which the main characters were Amanda and David. The first date was immediately followed by a second one, which marked the beginning of their romantic relationship. David's parents were wealthy people, and more than anything else, they dreamed that their beloved son would multiply their fortune. Therefore, when David got a new girlfriend, Olivia and Stephen Thompson announced their desire to get to meet her. "I hope she comes from a good family. No worse than Darcy Wallace, whose father is a bank director?" asked Mrs. Thompson. David smiled embarrassedly in response and hurried to change the subject of the conversation. He understood that his parents were unlikely to approve of his choice and therefore deliberately delayed the moment of their introduction. But when Amanda eventually came over to have dinner with Olivia and Stephen Thompson, their disappointment knew no bounds. "Who's that our son decided to date? Some poor roadside waitress?" Mrs. Thompson said indignantly after the dinner was over. "We'll have to have a serious talk with David. I already promised Rupert Wallace that David will marry his daughter, and soon. My plans didn't include his relationship with some orphan," added the head of the family. Meanwhile, the unsuspecting lovers walked down the moonlit alleys of the park and dreamed of their future together. "We will definitely get married, my love," David whispered and kissed Amanda tenderly. Unaccustomed to so much attention, Amanda was beyond happy, and it seemed like this feeling would last forever. Unfortunately, the young people couldn't have known that David's parents had already come up with a plan designed to break them up once and for all. The first step was to send David off to visit his grandmother, who lived on the other side of the country. Stephen Thompson took care of that part. But Mrs. Thompson got a more difficult mission, which required her to deceive the poor Amanda. Thus, the woman set up a meeting with Amanda, and in a confidential conversation, informed her that David already had a fiancé and that they would get married very soon. Of course, the young woman didn't believe David's mother at first. However, when she found out that her boyfriend went to the other side of the country for no good reason, she realized that she had been deceived by the rich guy. How's that possible? Was he lying to me all this time, while planning a wedding with someone else? Susan was right. All men are the same, Amanda thought with tears in her eyes. Amanda quit her job that same day and deleted David's number from her phone. Realizing that she had been betrayed, Amanda cried for days on end and cursed fate for letting her fall in love with someone so dishonest. Unfortunately, she had no way of knowing that David was thinking the exact same thing at that very moment, having been deceived by his own parents too. Having a hard time getting over the breakup, David was looking rather bad and even lost some weight. But his ex-fiancée had it even worse, because a month after the breakup, she found out that she was pregnant. Unable to stop crying, Amanda looked at the 2 stripes of her pregnancy test and didn't know what to do. Of course, even the very thought of an abortion was unacceptable for the young woman who grew up in an orphanage and therefore knew the value of parental care and affection. During the entire pregnancy, Amanda suffered from terrible morning sickness and dizziness, which literally never stopped. Nevertheless, the young woman continued to work as a shop assistant in a small store on the corner of Park Street up until she went into labor. She had some complications during childbirth, but it all ended fine, and Amanda gave birth to a beautiful baby, and her joy knew no bounds. The loving mother named her daughter Mary in honor of her late mother. Looking at her tiny daughter, the exhausted woman realized that she finally found the true meaning of life. Sure, raising a child alone was extremely difficult, so the young mother had to put in a lot of effort to provide for her daughter. 7 years flew by, and they all felt identical. Amanda was already used to being a single mother and working for days on end. She sought to provide her daughter with everything she needed. However, as it would soon turn out, things weren't as simple as they seemed at first. The fact was that after a medical checkup, Mary was diagnosed with a heart defect, which posed a real threat to her life. "What am I supposed to do now, sir?" "It's curable, isn't it?" Amanda asked in a trembling voice. "Yes, it can be treated, but the treatment is surgery. However, I have to warn you right away. This surgery is very, very expensive," the doctor said after a little hesitation. Hearing the amount she needed to raise, Amanda turned pale and, struggling to get a hold of herself, leaned on the edge of the table. The woman knew perfectly well that she couldn't raise so much money even in 10 years. Having left the clinic with tears in her eyes, Amanda began to feverishly think of every person she knew and whether she could borrow money from them. "Mommy, why are you crying? Did someone hurt you?" Mary asked. Amanda only smiled in response and patted her daughter on the head. Unfortunately, the single mother didn't have any friends who could lend her more than a few $100s. Realizing that her daughter's condition could worsen at any moment, Amanda did everything she could to raise the money. She even pawned everything she owned that was of any value. At the same time, the woman tried to make sure that her daughter spent more time in the fresh air and didn't withdraw into herself, spending all her days inside the house. One day, as she was taking a walk with her daughter in the park, the woman got distracted by her phone. At that moment, Mary saw a squirrel, which had come down from a tree in search of something tasty. Having noticed the fluffy animal, the girl ran towards it as fast as she could. At that very moment, Mary got a terrible sharp pain in her chest, which forced the girl to stop and fall to her knees. She was gasping for air, but because of the excruciating spasm, she couldn't even call out for help. Fortunately, a man that was passing by at that very moment quickly assessed the situation, and having placed the girl on her back, gave her an indirect heart massage. It all happened so fast that no other people around even had time to realize what was going on. Soon, Mary began to breathe again and opened her eyes. Seeing the girl come to her senses, her savior smiled and playfully winked at her. By this time, the eyewitnesses of the incident finally managed to get Amanda, who immediately rushed to her daughter. However, seeing the man who had saved Mary, she turned even paler and could hardly keep her balance. The truth was that looking at her was none other than David, only more mature than she had remembered him. "David, is that you? What are you doing here?" was about all the woman could say. "Let's leave all the questions for later. Your daughter had a heart attack. I'm taking her to a hospital, where I run the cardiac department," David answered in a tone that brooked no objections. Then he picked up and carried her to a parked car at the side of the road. On their way to the hospital, Amanda told David that Mary was his daughter. To say that the young doctor was shocked would be an understatement. However, the ex-lovers didn't have time for a longer conversation. Upon arrival at the hospital, Mary was quickly taken into pre-op, while David pledged to take care of all of the expenses. Fortunately, thanks to the highly professional and experienced cardiac surgeon, the girl survived. All this time, Mary's parents stayed by her side. Having forgiven each other for the mistakes of their past, the two of them realized that they still loved each other. By the time the girl was discharged from the hospital, David and Amanda were already back together. Only this time, David's wealthy parents could no longer do anything about it. Now, at the sight of Mary's happy face, Amanda and David felt that their hearts were beating in unison once again and were still full of love and tenderness towards each other.